One of the most powerful myths of modernity is that walls by their very nature must fall. Walls belong to the past and must be torn down by people who will move freely, by the annihilation of space and time, by markets, by progress, and by the spirit of enlightenment. Stories of oppressive walls torn down have formed the foundation of the collective identities of communities fashioning themselves as modern from the 19th century into our contemporary age. However, today it is clear that we need to revisit this story because it no longer fully describes our reality. In many ways, we live in a world ever more characterized by the building of walls on both national and neighborhood borders. But because tearing down walls is such a foundational image of the modern as it took on the feudal past, whenever we talk about walls, we inevitably talk about history. Yet, we don't have a very good understanding of how and why people who lived in walled, bounded communities in the past chose to open their borders. I study what happened when German cities decided to open their gates and take down their built boundaries, their walls and fortifications, in the 19th century. These are the walls and boundaries that people interacted with on a daily basis, the removal of which was part of the self-conscious experience of becoming modern in an industrializing age. This is a change to the landscape of Europe that has been so caricatured as an obvious side effect of modernization, industrialization, and growth that I found it had rarely actually been studied itself, not as a process, not as a side effect, but as an experience of individual communities and people. As a way of summarizing what I found through a series of detailed case studies in a number of German cities, I'm going to share with you 4 interconnected myths about the removal of city walls in the Central European city. These are myths that are familiar today, passed down to us as part of that myth of modernity, but that have their origins in how city dwellers began to talk about their city's changes in the 19th century. First, the myth of the radical break. In retrospect, both historical research and in popular imagination, we picture the tearing down of walls as once and for all moments. Even academic historians often describe cities bursting their walls. To take the not at all unusual example of the city of Leipzig, what did it mean for it to take down its walls? First, military fortifications were diminished through decades of semi-intentional neglect and the planting of gardens in and along the city edge. They were then dismantled in the 1770s and 1780s to make the city a more welcoming marketplace. City gates were later opened for unrestricted traffic in the 1820s. Remaining brick walls, which were still around the city, were torn down and then moats filled in piece by piece in many stages from the 1830s through the 1860s. The last economic marking of the urban border as a place policed for the exaction of excise taxes lapsed only in 1861. In other words, tearing down the wall took over a century, and the experience of becoming modern was not that of a dramatic and sudden breaking down of a boundary, but of living with partial, broken, and temporary boundaries. Closely related is the myth of the single boundary. One of the reasons city walls had been so long ignored by historians was that the removal of military fortifications was taken as that moment of radical break with the past, overshadowing what happened after. But fortified military boundaries were but just one piece of an elaborate border system with many separate parts. And these complex, diverse boundaries were taken down separately and gradually, yet perceived to be parts of a common border system by contemporaries. So when fortifications were dismantled, tax walls were often put up in their place. When walls were taken down, tree lines or building lines retained the edge of the city as an effective border. And border taxes could persist even without a wall, police and tax officials replacing stone. Representing the moment of tearing down the wall as a sudden moment of radical break also obscures the way walls as borders relied on an elaborate infrastructure of support, from taxing to policing to utilities, that took decades to dismantle. Next, the myth that growth equals openness. Decisions about opening gates and taking down walls often happened independently of economic health and growth. In many cities, walls came down before booms in population, sometimes dismantled at moments of poverty to encourage growth or to create a perception of openness at a time of diminishment. In fact, cities often took down their walls and opened their gates less out of practical considerations than out of a desire to appear modern, out of competition with rival cities, or to celebrate an important anniversary. Taking down a wall was often a decision about identity, not about border control or growth. Finally, the myth of history and nature. By the end of the 19th century, observers tended to conflate the historical city with nature. Treating older forms of settlement and boundaries as more natural, the canals of one-time border defenses became the charming streams of later generations, obscuring the ways that nature and interaction with nature continued from the pre-industrial to the industrial city. How does debunking these myths help us today? Both implicitly and explicitly, we draw on the historical narrative of industrial era growth to understand features of our contemporary world. Yet we misunderstand how and why the borders most people interacted with on a daily basis were dismantled. Recovering this full history gives us access to other, more useful stories about the spatial dynamics of modernization, allowing us to find space in between fairy tales of endless growth and backward-looking retrenchment of our divisions along constructed boundaries. Thank you.